Good morning and welcome back to Spid's YouTube. I used to be incredibly into Clash Royale. I got it in 2016, I don't remember if during beta or not, but I remember playing it quite actively for the first many years. I remember the reveal of cards like Princess and the Log as being incredibly exciting, and on my then second account being a massive Lava Loon player while repping good old 2.6 Hog on the main. I took a break after many years, and other than a minor stint or two, mainly re-picked it up again around about August. Clash Royale changed a lot by this latest pickup. There are now evolutions, champions, level 13 went to 16, and cards like Electro Spirit and Skeleton Dragons are still things I'm getting used to playing around. But it's been a lot of fun, and all of the new stuff has really changed a lot of what Clash Royale is. Part of getting into Clash Royale for me often ends up with getting into Clash Royale discourse. Being a live service competitive game, there's a bit more incentive, I find, to keep up with outside sources for update information, which means I end up engaging in a bit of interneting, and there's tons of Clash Royale discourse. This video is going to be a couple of things. At a broad level, it's just going to be my thoughts on some aspects of the game that I find to be quite interesting, just like what I normally do. But unlike previous videos, there's going to be a fair amount of engagement with some common discourse elements I see on sites like Reddit and YouTube, and a lot of what I'm going to say will be framed with things I see lacking in the discourse or acting in active juxtaposition to the discourse I see. As you'll see, I'm going to be positive about a lot of elements people have a lot of opposition towards, including things that people, rightfully, have flared up feelings about. In addition, my background and relationship to the game, I believe, is probably a little different than a lot of other people's. My mindset with Clash Royale is very much inspired from two things. My experience being a competitive Legends of Runeterra player, also known as LOR, and my memory of learning Clash Royale basics to the old max many years ago. We're going to cover a lot of ground in this video, and be moving between a lot of things, but my hope is that, even if you don't fully agree with me, you can at least see my perspective on a couple of hot button topics, as well as the tepid button ones. I won't be able to cover everything, but I'm going to try and cover the parts of the discourse I see constantly, especially those I disagree with the most on. I'll be mostly focusing on gameplay design, although Supercell's over-capitalistic interests will invariably come up. Last thing before we start, I originally wanted this video to be about 4 to 5 different Supercell games, but I had the most to say about Clash Royale and it already sustained a full-sized video on its own. I've splintered those other thoughts on the other Supercell games into a separate script, so Brawl Stars, Merge Tactics, and a couple other games will happen at some other time. Alright, let's talk about Clash Royale. Clash Royale is a pretty damn good game. I think when you're in the weeds of playing Clash Royale, it's easy to get stuck in a lot of the criticisms of recent updates and acknowledgement of the awful nature of the business model Supercell uses, but at a broad level, it's an incredibly fun game. It's a high-quality card game with an extreme variety of deck archetypes, playstyles, and skill expression. It does all the card game fundamentals right and has some skills that are really quite fun to test. Clash Royale was the first card game I spent any time learning how to get better at from outside sources. I remember watching a very, very old Orange Juice video about elixir trading. Seeing your units and spells as cards that have guaranteed interactions and using certain play patterns to gain an elixir advantage over your opponent so that you can set up larger pushes where you literally have more power due to more elixir than your opponent was such a revelation to a young me. The amount of ramifications there were for me from learning that is kind of crazy to think about. Elixir trading, as it's called in Clash Royale, is one of the quintessential card game fundamentals, and this skill is transferable to basically any competitive card game. If you follow Spid's YouTube because of my old Legends of Runeterra stuff, it's an extremely basic LOR concept too. Provided you've done some good unit or mana trading prior, you can set up a mid-range board with so much accumulated value that they can't beat you, or set up scenarios where they're constantly needing to top deck while you continually apply pressure, and this is just one consequence of elixir trading. It's not just elixir trading. Clash Royale also has all the other juicy card game stuff that makes learning and excelling at card games fun. Playing around the cards you know you're going to draw, learning to give specific answers due to your knowledge of what the opponent's going to do, getting into your opponent's mind and gameplay, and predicting, as I often see people say in Clash Royale, or forcing their moves. Deck building to have certain game plans into everything in your little meta, taking damage on your tower to bank elixir. It has everything. It has all the essential card game basics, and they all feel fun to play with, experiment with, and learn. That's, to me, one of Clash Royale's greatest strengths. In such an easy, fun, and accessible game in terms of visual and gameplay design, not progression, it has quite similar depths and skill expression as the greatest of card games, while also making all those elements its own. It's a card game that tons of people enjoy, even for those who would be bored at reading card text all day. It isn't my number one pick for greatest card game, it'll be a while before that's taken from LOR, but it's pretty high up there as a fun competitive card game, and I could easily see worlds where being incredibly into taking Clash Royale seriously with its mechanics and matchups and dynamics to be an invigorating and worthwhile experience, just like LOR was for me. I'm sure highly competitive players like Riley and Molake get the same thing I got from LOR, this incredibly rewarding feeling of mastery over a competitive mental craft, and the process of learning all the little interactions and strategy is enthralling. This most recent bout in Clash Royale was the first time I'd played after LOR, and with all CCGs, learning one helps learning another. I've got a much more holistic sense of what card game skills are, rather than learning everything fit for purpose for Clash Royale, which has me both appreciating Clash Royale more as a card game, as well as further displeasure for all the bits that detract from that experience. But having had such a large break since I most recently played, I appreciate a lot of the changes and decisions that recent additions have made to Clash Royale that change up a lot of the dynamics that didn't exist in the past. A lot of the card game fundamentals and skill expression that Clash Royale had and still has are improved on with a lot of the new additions. I think evolutions and champions were incredibly logical and smart new additions. One of Clash Royale's most inviting aspects is the quick cycle, where your deck is only 8 cards and that you constantly cycle through it. I think this is one of the more curious bits that separates it from other card games, second obviously to the board, and to have a mechanic basically built around the cycle is good. Having to pay attention to which version of the card the enemy gamer has in cycle, and having incentives to cycle to things yourself, and having certain interactions and pushes dictated by slightly different hand qualities due to evolution rotation, I think is just very reasonable game design. Similarly with champions, it also makes a lot of sense to me to add cards with activatable abilities to encourage more involved play and decision making. And slightly less so, I think the same is true of tower troops. The 3 new ones we have in game right now are a little basic, but I think this is another area that's very logical to introduce in terms of creating new gameplay patterns. And the consequences for how you build your deck and how you play against opponents with different tower troops is an area that's ripe for development. Dagger Duchess and Cannoneer, ignoring any aspect of their current strength or weakness, do create interesting theoretical questions about how to change your play into them, and with the knowledge of how others would change their playstyle, how you would want to build your decks with them. Like, if the enemy gamer has Duchess, you're incentivized to build pushes large enough such that you're pushing while she's out of daggers, which creates interesting dynamics for players who might have small unit cycle heavy decks like Bait or Miner. But then knowing that the opponent is thinking that way as the player with Duchess also means you want to incentivize the opponent to do small repeated pushes, which would mean not letting them develop a massive counter push if they're on a counter push deck, which could mean applying pressure in different ways to the norm. I know this isn't how it plays in game most of the time, but I think even this set of fairly logical consequences, among others, like these aren't the only ramifications of Dagger Duchess, is an example of the sort of gameplay questions that new introductions should aim to add. The same is true of Cannoneer. You don't get these sort of divergent gameplay patterns without making changes like these. If anything, I wish there were more radical tower troops. A lot of these systems get criticized both due to how progression works as well as balance, and we'll talk about progression and balance in a sec when we start moving towards some of the negatives that there are with this game. But I think it's worth acknowledging that in terms of the actual gameplay design of these elements, not necessarily how you access them or the strength of individual examples, evolutions and champions are absolute slam dunks, and tower troops are also quite a logical idea if only they actually added some more. Some specific evolutions I think are a little basic and boring, like I don't think Evo Zap or Barbs are particularly interesting, but the majority of evolutions are like good and fun ideas, and I think are better in the game than out. Evo Snowball, Evo Musketeer, Evo Cannon, and Evo Bomber are all interesting in how they change the game and influence matchups. And I think all the champions are at least somewhat interesting. Even Boss Bandit, who has the simplest ability, still has interesting questions that are asked of the defender in terms of how to defend, and in the player of when to use the ability. And if a new addition is giving you new ways to play and think about the game, I think that's generally speaking a good thing. This also goes for nearly every regular unit addition as well. Clash Royale is a very functional card game, with all of the card game fundamentals while having its own unique twists, as well as exciting and good skill expression, and a lot of the updates and new cards and abilities, I find, add to this more than detract. There is an elephant in the room. If you were playing Clash Royale in the last month, you're absolutely noticing the glaring omission in Heroes. I was pretty satisfied with what I had wanted to say in this video, having loosely planned everything I'd wanted to say back in October, and then they go ahead and announce and implement Heroes. I'm definitely much less negative than the general community is about Heroes. I don't think I've seen a single positive thing about Heroes, and I do have some positives, but I do think it's mostly negative. I think it's justifiable to want to add a second button to the game, to increase gameplay depth and to encourage interesting decision making, and I think it's okay if that button comes with some fantasy or vision of upgraded versions of cards we're familiar with. I think there's something genuinely reasonably exciting about what if Musket but had button, or what if Giant but had button. I think for a lot of games and a lot of other worlds, if the update was simply that, it would have been an incredibly good update, full of interesting new gameplay, increased skill expression, and also contributing to a fantasy of Clash Royale that would be exciting for future updates. But that, and that alone, is basically the only positive I believe there is about how they went about this implementation of Heroes. There are implementations of Heroes that wouldn't have had issues in my mind, but this onboarding was something diabolically bad. Progression is obviously an issue, and again, we'll get into it in the next section, but to quickly put something here, it feels demeaning that they also released this with level 16. The goal of saying, here's something that no one could want in level 16, but here's something we hope is exciting in Heroes to soften the blow, when Heroes, on their own merits as well, are also introduced in this awful way, feels like you're being put in an idiot sandwich where you, the player, is the butt of the joke. It feels like a slap in the face. But there are other big issues I have with how they went about this initial implementation. 3 of the 4 introductory heroes feel like they weren't refined properly, like they didn't have enough time in the tank to properly consider an exciting way to introduce this concept. Hero Musketeer is actually a fairly interesting idea. A unit that summons a building, where both the unit and the building are actually somewhat fragile, and with an expensive cost to get the building from nothing being 7 mana. There's something there. But Musketeer is a really good unit, and the simple, obvious way to make a mechanic where a unit summons a building interesting would be to have a weak unit that has a strong turret. Like, I don't know, Cannon Cart, where the unit is worse than Musket, but it comes with something. Instead, you get a very well-costed unit in Musketeer with an above-rate ability. That is actually not irreconcilable. This implementation for heroes, where it's the base card plus something, obviously comes with a power level increase, and that can be okay. There's nothing inherently wrong with increasing power level. But I think for a lot of people, increasing power level only feels right and justifiable if a new gameplay fantasy feels like it needs the power level change in order to make the fantasy make sense, and I don't think unit that summons a building needed to be Musketeer that summons a building. There's a leap here between what could be an interesting design element to here's Hero Musketeer that feels slightly off. Hero Musketeer, absent of what actually happened in the background at Supercell, feels like it was designed backwards, where they wanted to introduce heroes as a concept, cards we know with activated abilities, and try to conclude what button makes most sense for Musket, rather than how can we make a card we're curious to make more interesting. And while I think that approach is okay for later heroes, where we know cards with a hero button is a concept we can be excited for, as an onboarding process, I don't think it makes a lot of sense. This might seem a strange and rather weird critique to have on Hero Musketeer, but I think it's actually my only real issue with Hero Musketeer as introduced. I also think, had this been Hero number 10, where we have a better sense of what a post-hero power level is, maybe it would not have seemed so bad, but this mix of already good unit with a very good ability with no negative consequence in the deck builder on a card that doesn't evocatively feel like this ability is warranted feels strange to me. So, had this been a new card entirely, had this been later so we had a better sense of what kind of strength hero powers would have so we could be excited about Musket getting this strength, had a ton of other factors been different, maybe it would have been better. But Hero Musketeer, in her current form as an onboarding hero, I think missed the mark. Hero Mini P.E.K.K.A is, I think, boring, which is perhaps an even worse sin. Maybe the pancake joke works for others, but I've personally never really cared for this Mini P.E.K.K.A pancake obsession being such a prominent part of the humor of the game. And gaining 1 to 5 levels is such an extremely okay effect. There is a little bit of intrigue created by the scaling nature of the button and the capacity to heal, so there's a bit of a question about greed with it, but otherwise it's just fine. The one with the most discussion has been Hero Knight. A lot of people see this ability as fundamentally flawed, and I definitely disagree with that. All card games will have hard and fast rules that get broken by new design, and that's very okay. That's part of introducing new concepts to make new experiences. I've gone back and forth about whether I find the radius to be too big or a fine size. In versions of this script, I've written for both. 7.5 tiles is insanely long and definitely gives a lot of leeway in situations where that leeway seems unwarranted. I feel like there's 2 separate exciting ideas behind this ability, and different radii allow for different potential excitements. Like, at a 3 to 5 tile radius, you're still redirecting aggro, but you're not going to be able to, say, get a giant skeleton off the tower, or redirect an expo without putting the knight in too much danger. But you can still do a plethora of interesting things, like counter a goblin barrel, or a swarm on your tower, etc. Like, a 3 to 5 tile radius is already interesting, and my instinct initially was to say, well, that's interesting enough, why not stick to that with a 3 to 5 tile radius rather than 7.5? But seeing it in game, at mid-ladder mind you, most opponents rarely use this ability, because if they can afford 5 elixir to defend a push with a central hero knight, they can pretty likely defend it with 3 without needing to use the power. So giving it that extra leeway to deal with things in part, like giant skeleton or a safer expo redirect, kind of makes a little sense to me. I'm torn. I think the ability radius didn't need to be that large to have an interesting ability, but also I think the ability right now is relatively okay. And there's 2 very easy levers to pull on for balance in the future, being radius and shield health, so no matter what the balance and enjoyability of it is now, it'll be easy to manipulate the variables in future. Hero Giant is extremely acceptable, and I think is a perfect example of this concept. A revitalization, best implemented via an ability to add a new and interesting dynamic for both the player and the opponent, and creates a cool fantasy for the card. That's perfect, no notes. If all 4 of the introductory heroes were like that, I think absent of any progression questions, it would be one of the better updates. And Hero Musket and Hero Knight are actually not that far from the quality of Hero Giant in my opinion. All they needed was a few tweaks or to be implemented at a different time. But as it currently stands, as an introduction to this concept, I think 3 of the heroes were half-baked and introduced in a way to unfortunately make the concept seem unexciting when this whole mechanic could actually be fairly interesting and probably will come to be in future. I touched on it briefly earlier, but a lot of the criticism about heroes has been the power level change. Unlike introducing a new card where it has to compete at the same level with every other card, or a new Evo that only has to compete with other Evos, introducing a way for a deck to literally just get flatly better because now 2 slots can be dedicated to an upgraded version of cards will change the power level of the game. I think Evos were right in doing so, and honestly 6 years down the line with 30 more heroes or whatever, it'll feel fine, but I think it's okay to be annoyed that the power level the game has been at for the last 2 years with Evos will no longer be accessible. Clash Royale pre-hero power level was a really enjoyable power level, and forever now will the power level be balanced around a deck that has 4 regular cards, 2 evolved cards, and 2 heroes/champions. This is a common pattern for a lot of card games, where a new concept changes power level, and again, there's nothing inherently wrong with the change in power level, but it's also understandable if someone doesn't enjoy the new power level. But on that, again, the release played a part in making that transition feel awkward. I think a lot of the criticism would have been avoided if there was only one champion/hero slot, so heroes would be more clearly competing with champions, which already had a unique slot. Even if the goal was to have 2 heroes/champs eventually, the fact is there's only 8 champions and 4 heroes. I just don't think that's enough options to have 25% of your deck's theoretical strength dedicated to those slots, especially when only 4 of them are the direct upgrade type. I think it's too restrictive rather than permissive. There's simply not enough variation. Once they hit, say, 20 champs and heroes, I think it would be fine to give the second slot, but I can't imagine that it was right to do 2 slots immediately. Had the introduction been, you can replace your champion with a hero, I feel like that would have sat better. I wasn't playing when evolutions were announced, but according to the wiki, the game only gave you 1 slot when they were announced, at a time with 4 evolutions, and only by the 11th evolution did the ranked mode have a second Evo slot. I don't know how that went with the community when the second slot was added, but I think 2 Evo slots works nowadays, and 2 champ/hero slots will eventually find a satisfying gameplay situation. It'll just take growing pains and this unfortunately awful introduction. Another criticism I've seen lobbied against heroes is one I do think is barking up the wrong tree. I've seen this sentiment frequently that they should have finished all the Evos before adding a new concept. I think this, completionist perspective on live service game design isn't the best way to think about things. I think it's okay if some cards don't get Evos. I'd rather developers implement new and engaging gameplay than feel as if they need to spend 3 to 4 years making sure they finally square off the Fire Spirit Evo or the Poison Evo before being able to work on a new exciting thing. I think a lot of people get stuck in thinking that the point of Evos is to encourage the use of cards that have been bad for a while, but I think that's more of a side product or exciting consequence of new implementations rather than the main goal. I think the main goal, from a design standpoint, should be new, fun gameplay and fantasy, and I think Evos hit that well, and I don't think not introducing heroes because Evos aren't done isn't the right way to think about things or to criticize heroes as a concept. Similarly, although no one is talking about this, I also think it would be extremely okay to add second Evos to cards that the developers have an interesting idea for, or have cards that have both a hero and an Evo, just like Musket and Knight. Hell, this current version of Hero Knight would have also made sense as a second Evo if the ability was on summon. All of these are the same thoughts I had for LOR. It's the same reason why I think a second Lux wasn't a bad idea. The designers had an idea for a new take on Lux, and that's fine and cool. Alright, final thing on heroes. I know I've talked about them a lot, there's a lot to say unfortunately. I normally try and talk about game design or user experience because that's often the thing I find most interesting. But the visual design of heroes are so ugly. Evos actually look quite nice a lot of the time and don't have some sort of forced, evolved visual aesthetic. Evo Musket, Evo Witch, Evo Royal Ghost all look great. The Evo Hogs do the funny when pigs fly joke, but at least they have the visual design space to do a joke like that. The heroes just look ugly. The over-gold and saturated piss-colored nonsense just looks terrible. I really hope, for their sake, that they don't stick to this aesthetic wholly in future, and they only have it for the 3 royally British medieval fantasy and also the mini P.E.K.K.A cards, because it looks terrible. To me, it looks like corporate gold slop. There's no heart or character in these designs. Now, I'm certain my positivity towards a lot of these elements was a little frustrating for some of you, because while before I was focusing primarily on the ideal vision and the game design of these elements, which either are or could be quite good, it's rarely the case that when an update comes out, you get to experience the satisfaction that these introductions ought to give. And if you do play against them, they often seem a bit overtuned. Live service competitive games often get this issue and conversation about the relationship between releasing content, strength of that content, and access to that content. If cards are hard to access, then a strength inequality feels unfair because you get put in situations where you can be at a disadvantage without any agency in the matter. I can totally see how this is frustrating for a large group of people, and I absolutely do not blame anyone for feeling frustrated at this dynamic. It's unfair and it sucks. Progression in Clash Royale is extremely strange, and by strange, I mostly mean bad. In online CCGs, which is what I think Clash Royale is most comparable to, when you unlock a card, you've unlocked it, which also means unlocking it at its highest strength. Like in LOR or Hearthstone, once you own a card like Treasure Seeker, you own Treasure Seeker. There's no level 1 Treasure Seeker that has a 1-1 stat line, and then you collect 6 more Treasure Seekers and spend 100 gold to combine them to get a 2-1 Treasure Seeker and net 100 player experience. Like, that would be crazy. But in Clash, that is what you have to do. A new card comes out and you need to collect thousands of it to level it up to the strength of your deck. It is bad. It is actively resistant to your agency. It's capitalistic, laborious design to have new content gated by what is essentially asking your players to spend hours in your game to have the content be accessible and fun to them. Or, obviously, spend hundreds of dollars. Clash Royale is absolutely not unique for having a grind aspect, and many games do have content you need to grind for, but they don't necessarily come with this leveling aspect to it. It's the leveling specifically, I think, that is a bit weird. This is going to sound absolutely bonkers, but I think Clash Royale would be a much better game if it was more like Hearthstone, where it takes much longer to unlock Princess or Archer Queen initially, be it chance-based or reward-based, but once you do, you have the card at its highest level. That might seem like a strange opinion to have, that a game would be better if it was more like Hearthstone of all games, but I think this makes more sense to me. This, by the way, is essentially how EVOs work. You don't level up your EVO, you either have it or you don't, even if it's a month or 3 between getting a new EVO. Clash Royale actually has 2 progression systems. There's the leveling and gold and XP system used on the collection page, and then there's also a trophy road progression system, where you unlock unlockable content, specifically the cards that you could find in chests, gradually. And recently, evolutions and heroes were also added/moved to the trophy road. It is so strange, like genuinely so strange, that your ability to play with things is gated by both the amount of trophies you have and the amount of time it takes for you to open enough chests, such that the new content that you have recently allowed to be unlocked is equal in level to the content you were using previously to get to the point by which you could access the content you have just recently unlocked. That is weird to me. That is such a weird system. And it's very strange too, on top of that, to artificially increase the ceiling. I was watching the Abdid video about level 16, and he talks about his utter displeasure for it. One thing he does in that video is he makes a really interesting comparison to Clash of Clans, where people get excited about new levels, because a new level means new content they can play with. Content is gated by levels, but that's okay for a lot of players, because you unlock new gameplay experiences with each level. This was a revelation that had only occurred to me after seeing this video. Why does Clash Royale even have levels? Like at all, they don't add new gameplay. To me, leveling is the single biggest weirdness, and I would probably say issue Clash Royale has in its design. There is somewhat of a theoretical joy one can get from increasing their collection. Having an account that's uniquely yours with your unique contributions and unlocks and identity has some fun in it. I think people ignore this sometimes, but having a collection that is uniquely you can be a fulfilling aspect of gaming. Like, on the complete other side of this, you had a game like Legends of Runeterra, where you never needed to worry about unlocking something, you could always get it because card acquisition was so incredibly easy. This meant there wasn't this excitability or uniqueness to anyone's collection, because everyone had the same collection, everything. This is something Grappler mentioned a lot the day LOR PvP was sunsetted. But this idealistic sense for the joys of an idiosyncratic collection is like the only real positive. The consequences of this system make it such that when a new card is announced or a meta shift happens and your deck is suddenly disadvantaged, you can't switch to another deck because it won't be leveled up enough. The weird minigame of having what you can play be dictated by what you got out of chests and how you decided to spend your wildcards temporarily, I think is extremely frustrating and not how games should work. Also, no dupe protection for heroes is one of the most despicable choices they could have made, along with level 16. There's like a rude quality in that. A statement made by capital-focused higher-ups about their utter disrespect for the consumer, whale or not. When Abdid made his video, I didn't necessarily agree with all of it. Before the wider community knew what that special teaser that turned out to be Hero Minipacker was actually to be, Abdid said something along the lines of, "There's nothing to be gained for the player by adding a new level." And my instinct was to say, well, what if the teaser shows something that is to be gained by having a new level? Because intuitively, leveling as a system does make sense if each time you level, you unlock something exciting and interesting. If leveling was the main progression system for unlocking new variety content, like in Clash of Clans or other such games, that would, in my opinion, not make level 16 bad. But there's no relationship between the level of cards or player level to new experiences, and I think that is bad. Sometimes I try and think of a more apt word to use other than bad, but in this instance, bad is the most apt word. Had the update involved a progression rework to radically change the relationship between levels and content, and had heroes been part of that, depending on the specific implementation, I think that would have been pretty okay. Obviously, it wasn't. This really all comes back to Clash Royale being a live service game. Live service games are really strange in that once there's a system added, it's really hard to remove that system, even if to the detriment of newer design philosophies or ideas. You need new content for the live service model to work, but new and interesting gameplay mechanics often come at odds with content made in previous years, possibly by previous designers. I think levels back in 2016 made a little bit of sense in terms of a way of giving a feeling of progression and excitement, but I think that same feeling of progression and excitement can actually be felt in Trophy Road progression and in unlocks, in the world where unlocks are actually rare. Levels were in the game during a time where there weren't even legendaries. In a game where they know in future that there will be legendaries, champions, heroes, and evos, I don't think leveling would have been necessary to give feelings of uniqueness to accounts. It is reasonable, I believe, to have intentionally simpler content at the start of someone's playthrough a game and to have more complicated content only accessible later on. Like, I don't think someone immediately upon downloading the game should have access to a card like Elixir Golem or Graveyard. But many games are fine with just one way to get new content, and I think if the game just went with levels, i.e. a certain amount of gold and XP spent, basically translating into time spent in the game, as a way to unlock new unlockable content, or Trophy Road, I think that would make a lot of sense. Instead, we have this hodgepodge system where the first copy of cards are easy to get. Like, it's not that hard to get a copy of each legendary. You're just not allowed to play with them in your deck until you sit for a couple of months for the RNG to vaguely equalize that card with yours. It's extremely strange game design-wise. I recognize that for some people, they're gonna think I'm missing the bigger picture here. I know that the most salient way to view the game design decisions in Clash Royale isn't just in terms of gameplay fantasy, fun, skill expression, and so forth, as you would hope most game design perspectives to be from. I am fully aware of this. I get that it's more salient to be constantly in a conversation about seeing all of these decisions, leveling, heroes, lack of dupe protection, etc., in terms of capitalistic greed. My focus on treating Clash Royale's game design as if it wasn't under these elements isn't to be intentionally misleading or to be intentionally naive, but to take this as an exercise to put Clash Royale under a lens that I think people often ignore for the low-hanging, but still quite juicy fruit of greed. Videos and analyses that critique Clash Royale's game design get stuck in this rut about the company's relationship to money and that consequential relationship to player experience. These are absolutely important topics to keep in mind, and I agree wholeheartedly with that endeavor, but I also think there is great value in viewing Clash Royale on its own in a lens absent of that reality. If you want me to say statements like Clash Royale is exorbitantly greedy and Supercell is a perfect example of the capitalist relationship to art, or the expectation of labor that companies have over our free time is a disgusting amoral act that shouldn't be accepted societally, legally, and morally, etc. Yeah, I agree with all that. I just don't think that's the most interesting thing I had to say in the video. I'm not blind, I just think there are other things to say. One part of my overall goal with this video was to take Clash Royale at its best vision. If you give it all the allowances you could give, what do you see positively? What issues still come up? And consequently, what greatnesses are we prevented from having because of those issues? What do things like heroes and levels do in a world where we're not thinking about money? An approach that takes the best form of another's argument isn't necessarily the best way to think about things. You should take things realistically, rather than blindly on their best merits. If there's a bigot around, you don't need to constantly engage with them at their best form in the marketplace of ideas. You're allowed to go for low blows, and I'm using air quotes there. But to me, this is the process I felt I wanted to go down for a Clash Royale video. A process I see very little of, both with heroes and broadly, and a process that there is sometimes merit to reminding yourself of. I think it's also worth acknowledging that this capitalistic drivel isn't throughout the whole company. I'm sure the lower level designers and those in the middle between economic executives and gameplay executives are trying to do what they can despite the barreling of stockholders and financiers. Lower level designers aren't adding level 16 so their individual wage can go up. Community managers aren't pocketing the $10 you spent to level your deck. It's the system above. The last bit of this little trifecta with progression and economic interests is balance. Clash Royale discourse is constantly talking about balance. I'm of a couple minds on this. The first is that, having only re-gotten back into Clash in the last 3 to 4 months, I can't really justify making broad and sweeping statements. Watching some 20 Grats videos isn't going to make me an expert on how it feels to play through these changes, especially since I'm not even at 10k, or I guess the max has changed since I've started writing this, but 10k trophies. I can backfill some information with like playing past the old max in Hog Mountain back when Hog Mountain was the max, and having experience being in the weeds of a different live service competitive game for years, but that's all in the mind. It's not really in the heart of what like recent Clash Royale players have had to go through. But the second mind, however, is to push back against this constant negative discourse of balance. I think there's a couple of acknowledgements that should be made about Clash Royale's relationship to balance. I think a lot of the new releases and updates, at the very least the ones I've been around for, have been extremely fine. Evo Royal Ghost, Evo Hogs, Evo Skarmy, and the 3 Muskie rework were all like extremely okay. My understanding is that Evo Royal Ghost and Hogs were good enough to have some decks feel a little stronger, and they were in the top 30% or so of cards, and like, that seems like a good thing to me. Generally speaking, if a developer can choose between 2 versions of a card, one that's slightly underpowered or slightly overpowered, I think it's right to pick the overpowered version. I think it's better to have a slight meta shakeup with a new top 20 card than a month of the same old with a nothing burger of a card. If it's between a slightly underpowered and a greatly overpowered, I'd probably prefer the slightly underpowered, but that's not necessarily the better choice if the previous meta was unfun. Balance's goal is to create a fun metagame, not necessarily to have perfect 50% win rates for every single card. And most games construct worlds with extremely enjoyable metagames that have unbalanced win percentages. Clash Royale definitely struggles to afford that leniency due to the gamification of progression, but it's not impossible for games to have this. I've seen enough Grats videos to know that some metas are wholly defined by a single newly released card to the exclusion of all others. Like, every Grats video you sit around and wait till the last 10 minutes for him to go, and then Phoenix was introduced, which is a very fun tradition. And like, yeah, seeing how prominent Phoenix Monk was in their meta, I get it. But in the grand scheme of all competitive card games, and even any real competitive live service game, yeah, sometimes designers will create something so monstrously strong that it's the only reasonable thing to play. Happens in every card game. lmoa had the exact same thing happen sometimes. But the majority of Clash Royale updates do, generally speaking, seem to be mostly fine. Sometimes a new edition will be an S or A tier deck for a bit, and sometimes it lasts for a while, but the majority of the time it feels like new additions and changes aren't particularly overwhelmingly disgusting. Now, I'm writing this stuff the day before heroes are actually in the game, and heroes are a bit of an edge case where they can't not increase the power level of the game. This comment and argument I'm making will probably fall on deaf ears, as it's one of the few updates that can't not come with a power level increase, but on the balance over the last few years, I think this is right. Most of the time, there's rarely been some absurd power level increase overall with a new addition, and if there's been something a little strong, it just needs some tuning, and at least the months I've been playing, the tuning has been pretty okay, be it on release or the month after. As good as most games' tuning is, possibly better than many. Plus, I think one thing I appreciate a lot about Clash Royale that no one ever seems to really give that much credit to Royale for is the presence of so many functional, fun, and balanced in their playstyle evergreen decks. Hog 2.6, Bait, Minor Loon, and a ton of other decks are decks that have just been absolutely solid for a while and continue to be good choices. Whether you started playing Clash Royale yesterday or 6 years ago, Hog 2.6 is something you could have picked up and felt good about. And they are fun, good decks that show the fundamentals of general Clash Royale play while being quite dynamic matchup-wise. The same is true of things like Expo and Mega Knight, which, while I think many players find them frustrating, I respect there are so many archetypes that are continually accessible and good. Most of the footage in the background is me playing a deck that, in my understanding, has been pretty good for the past few years and has slotted in as a new evergreen deck. And it's good fun, and there's vague assurance that it will probably be good and fun for a little while longer. I've got one more main reason why I don't think Clash Royale has a particularly unique or salient balance problem. It'll take a little journey, but come on, you're 30 minutes into me talking about this game, you can accept a little detour. Clash Royale has a different problem, that it's incredibly difficult and essentially impossible to realistically change your deck. At the very least, you're punished for doing so. This isn't like a particularly revealing statement. Everyone knows this. That's part of the universal suffering we all have as free-to-players, the acknowledgement that we want to enjoy the game and chose our poison of a deck like it was a starter Pokemon when we got around to around Arena 13 or so, after investing wildcards and trades into it and stuck with it. The level-based progression system's biggest gameplay issue is that when climbing ladder, the main way people play Clash Royale, sometimes you get thrust into a couple of situations that wouldn't occur otherwise. I think the majority of the time, you're typically in for a good fun time with vaguely equally leveled cards and are able to play the fun bit that is the game of Clash Royale. But a sizable proportion of the time, I'll say 20%, but it varies, you're fighting opponents who are too numerically strong for you to do anything about them. They quite literally will have 20% more health and deal 20% more damage than you, which is a multiplicative issue, kind of. It's more about interactions, but every single interaction over the course of the whole game. And while you can see if you're a 40%-ish better player than them, that's not a reasonable request for the game to make of you. Then some other proportion of the time, you're in a tough matchup, or you're not as knowledgeable about the matchup as the opponent, or you make a big misplay that the opponent manipulates to a good victory, and it means you lose, but at least there, in some way, there's an actionable component to it. There is at least still, like, a fun bit. However, when you make progress with that actionable component, you try the matchup in a different way, you manipulate a misplay they made, you show some sort of skill expression that gives you a victory, all it really does in terms of how games will feel in the future is that it'll increase the proportion that you see people with a higher stat line advantage. Moving up 80 trophies means your opponents are 80 trophies better, be that due to skill or raw stats. Since you're stuck on your deck, if you can't make forward progress easily, and a lot of your games are games where a difference in skill is the lesser cause of the loss, it's often intuitive to reach for balance as the lever to explain why. If you lost due to a poor matchup, possibly without even knowing if it's a poor matchup or not, it may seem intuitive to reach for balance as a metric as well. This is something I see constantly. But I don't think an imbalance is that pronounced. In fact, even if an imbalance, in whatever sense you want that to mean, were in fact around, if you could change decks while maintaining an equal level, it wouldn't matter. Boss Bandit cycle is really strong where you're at right now. Play a counter deck, add a tech card in, that helps a lot. But you can't do that right now with Clash Royale. Let's say I'm struggling with Swarm cards in the minor Loon deck, I can't justify changing Musketeer for Wizard, even if I see Swarm 20% of the time, because my Wizard is further underleveled, and so I'm giving up all the Fireball matchups for no reason, because my Wizard is a dead to Fireball Wizard and my Musket is not, among many, many, many other interactions. There are a lot of reasons why a given Clash Royale match might be frustrating, and a change in balance would possibly alleviate that frustration. But so would a change in a myriad of different things, and I don't think some actual balance metric is the most salient issue most of the time. I never felt balance to be an issue in LOR. In fact, there was only a single meta archetype I ever disliked to an extent that it made the game unfun for me to play. The game was fun, I was constantly improving, and I could always use my agency to get better at the game, whether it's trying out new archetypes or mastering matchups with decks I know I enjoy the play patterns of. Clash is nearly capable of being very similar, but it isn't. You can't change decks, so your agency is restricted, and furthermore, you're placed in a bracket to be of a similar card level to those around you, since you can't actually progress past it due to the bonus stat line those above you have. A lot of people feel this sense of a lack of being able to get a higher trophy count as being constantly a struggle against decks that they can't beat. A lot of the cards people tout as problem cards are also cards where being 1 to 2 levels up matters a lot. 10% more health and damage on a Hog Rider or Mega Knight often means 1 to 2 more hits, especially Mega Knight, who gains the most raw stats, being one of the beefiest and damagiest cards, and thus feels the worst. 10% more health and damage is often the difference between 0 damage and 800 damage. But if levels were equalized and you were able to change decks, I think this feeling would be fairly negated. I think a lot of the frustrations people experience from matchups and gameplay dynamics that feel unfair to them wouldn't feel as unfair, which is, in essence, what a balance complaint is. This felt unfair to me. I didn't enjoy how unfair it felt. Typically, I mean, there are other reasons people complain about balance, but I think this is the main one. Clash Royale's balance is basically as good, as far as I can tell, as every other game's. So when people complain about balance, I think I just don't get it. I don't see it. At best, it's either venting, which is fine, or it's a frustration where the source of it is that you can't use your agency to get better, while in most games, even in unbalanced metas, you could use your agency to improve. But agency is limited by a two-pronged issue. You are limited by your strongest deck, the deck that you've been stuck with for months and that you can't forwardly progress in, or you change some cards to be a lower level, which weakens your deck anyway, even if it would technically hit some sort of techie thing in some matchups. But this leads into the third thought. No matter the truth of balance in terms of numerical or comparative terms, at the end of the day, feelings do matter. If players feel like the meta sucks, if they say we want balance, that means there's a negative feeling that ought to be addressed. If players feel like X and you're a live service game and you have a desire to make your game enjoyable, which I think you should, ideally, and X is like a bad thing, then I think you do have an onus to address it. And while I personally think claims of balance being a particularly bad issue in Clash is often not placed in the right way, the frustration still clearly exists. And obviously the frustration exists in large part due to the progression issues, but also like communicative issues. But live service competitive games have an issue between balance and access, where Clash Royale chooses low access, so an imbalance where you can't use your agency to gain success because your deck was nerfed or a hard counter was introduced and is a little stronger sucks. And feeling frustrated, whether you diagnose it as a balance issue or a progression issue or whatever, is still an expression of a feeling you have, and that is always at least somewhat right. Parts 1 through 5 really formed the main diatribe I wanted to say on Clash Royale. I hit all the big topics and discussed the things I was most interested in. There's like one more thing I wanted to quickly touch on, and it didn't really flow well into the previous chapters, so I've just sort of ham-fisted it here at the end. Another system I've heard a lot of complaints about is the replacement of chests with lucky drops. Absent progression speed, lucky drops are better than chests, I think. I think there's a romanticization about having 4 chest slots and having the excitement build up about knowing you want a magical chest and needing extra time to open it, but I think it's a poor quality for a game to ask you to constantly have in the back of your mind a need to open it every X hours in order to be maximally efficient. I know that's fairly common in mobile games, but I think an imploration to do something more than once a day is the sort of design I think is harmful for the brain. The old chest system asked you to make sure you could always be near your phone every 3 hours and be aware of when you plan to sleep, so you can open your 8-hour chests while asleep. I don't know how many people did this, but I certainly remember staying up an extra 30 minutes or so to make sure the silver chest had finished its timer so I could start the gold chest before I went to bed. I think that sort of dynamic is not something that should be encouraged, and I much preferred Lucky Drop simply encouraging 15 to 30 minutes of gameplay throughout any time you want in the day, instead of opening up the app every 3 hours. Lucky Drops aren't wholly better morally. The visual design of Lucky Drops is such gamble addiction slop and frankly should not be the way they are. Tap for a chance to increase the loot is such a slop-tastic, disgusting mental plague that I have a massive aversion to. If progression got nerfed during a new introduction, I think it's right to be frustrated about that, but honestly, the fact that I only have to open the app once a day feels best for me. And if requesting cards in the clan could also be made to be a once a day thing, I think that would also be good. As a side story, one thing that does change about Lucky Drops is how you access leveling up cards. In the old system, most of what you unlocked came from chests, which were much broader in what you unlocked. You would get a very even distribution of commons, rares, and epics, which meant over the course of, say, a month, I think a lot of your progression would feel kind of flat, as you were gaining small amounts of everything all the time. Nowadays, Lucky Drops give you a higher amount of cards of a type, but only 1 card per drop. So, in that same month, I think there's a bit more heightened variation in the Lucky Drop version, where some things you get a great outpouring of due to a lucky 4 or 5 star or a good set of 3 stars. This is also the case for a lot of the trophy road. The majority of the chests are giant chests, the chest type that also attempts to do this taller, more of the same cards are gotten kind of shtick, rather than a wider amount of cards. Same with the choose X or Y that trophy road now has. Inspired by this, when I was making a second account to see how the game felt with all the new systems from the start, the Lucky Drops, the increased chests and Trophy Road and Pass Royale, the pick X or Y, I gave myself a little self-imposed challenge that uses these changes. This will sound really silly, but bear with me. All of the cards in my deck were to be cards that were the highest level and were the closest to leveling up to the next level. What this meant was a couple of things. Whenever a Lucky Drop went 4 or 5 star and came with a bajillion of 1 card, that card was now included in the deck. Whenever I got to a new arena and unlocked a new rarity, epic, legendary, champion, my deck was inundated with that new rarity. And the pick X or Y often meant that card was immediately slotting into my deck. The deck was constantly changing, but also felt random, sans pick X or Y choices, which felt like there was a reason to be given that agency. And this account is from where all the non-Minor Loon clips you've been seeing have come from. After a while, it equalized into a deck that I've been playing for the last month or so, give or take some cards, in part because I got very quickly to the max storage of wild cards, and I just hated the idea mentally of missing out on wild cards, so I used them, which solidified my deck into being Witch, Royal Ghost, Minions, and Fireball. So if I were to do this again, or to recommend it to someone else, I'd say just don't use the wild cards, even if you feel a little bit bad about like missing out on potential better value. I think it'll be more fun, but it was still a very fun time, and a unique way to use the new way cards are accessed. If you're thinking about making a second account at some point in the far future, I'd say give this a shot in early progression at the very least. Plus, as I understand it, most of the enemies you fight early on are bots in Clash Royale, and if you're making a second account, you're already going to be like somewhat better than the bots. So like, what else are you gonna do to have fun? May as well like have a weird deck building challenge. That's nearly everything I wanted to say on Clash Royale. I went over a lot, so I want to quickly summarize the main talking points I had. Clash Royale is a very good card game. It does card game logic well, it has its own very unique spin on card game mechanics, and it's a very accessible, in terms of understandable and fun, and deep card game. I think that's something I quite respect about the game. I think Evos, Champions, and Tower Troops are all good additions. Maybe some specific examples are a bit uninspired, and there's certainly some issues between the relationship between releasing content, strength, and accessibility. But these are good ideas overall. Heroes could be good, and I don't think that they're inherently terrible, but there were so many aspects wrong about its implementation that I simply couldn't just say, wow, nice design, without feeling like I'm ignoring all that's wrong about how they went about it. Progression, levels, and the sins of being a long-standing live service game have really made Clash Royale have some attributes to it that are quite debilitating, especially as it comes to, leveling. It's worth acknowledging the capitalistic nature of how Supercell operates and that effect on user experience, but my goal with this video is to try and focus on some very different lenses. On balance, I kinda waffled a bit to be honest, but the core things were that, yes, I've not been playing during some of the worst of times, so I can't be too critical, but also, when there's complaints about balance, there's a mess of different things going on, and sometimes that involves a lack of recognizing holistically what balance is, or not realizing particular instances of things had to come with a power level increase. I also talk about solid evergreen decks, and also acknowledge that if you feel bad, that's okay. But to me, the main thing above all else is that balance isn't really an issue. Basically, it's as good as every other live service competitive games balance, which I've always found to be extremely fine. And I think in a world where progression isn't as much of an issue, balance would be barely an inconvenience, sans the most absurd of times. And finally, I think lucky drops are better than chests, but not without their faults, and there's a fun minigame for an alt account that they encourage, and that was fun for me. Alright, thanks for watching. I hope you got something out of this video. If you want to discuss any of it with me, the comments are open and free, or you can join the Spids YouTube Discord if that's better for you. Other than that, see you later, alligators.